Which is worse, a bully who won't stop interrupting or somebody who knows what they's talking about? Well, Greg ain't sure, but he's got some tactics for dealing with both. And personally, I think he did a better job with the bullies. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And today we've got a 2-for-1 special on account of chapters 14 and 15 is both kind of short, so I'm going to try and squeeze both of them into one video. And chapter 14 starts off with a list of 4 reasons why folks sometimes refuses to listen to good arguments. Quote, I think there are 4 reasons for resistance, and I would like to explain what those are. Then I will give you a step-by-step plan to deal with that overconfident, overbearing, and often overwhelming interrupter I call a steamroller. End quote. And Greg kind of glosses over the first reason, which is that sometimes folks has valid objections to the arguments you's making. And okay, if you's committing a logical fallacy in your argument or making false assumptions, folks who see the problem ain't likely to be convinced. But Greg says there's 3 other reasons why folks won't listen, and them's the ones he's going to go over. Quote, first, people have emotional reasons to resist. Many have had annoying experiences with Christians or painful encounters with abusive churches. End quote. And this one's kind of true and kind of not true. It's true that people sometimes refuse to listen to valid arguments and evidence on account of emotions. On the other hand, apologists and evangelists has a tendency to use this one as an ad hominem argument to try and discredit the testimony of ex-Christians like me. Oh, they say, it ain't that you's got rational reasons for disbelief, it's that you's being all emotional because you feel like you's been hurt by God or by some Christian, and you's letting your emotions override your intellect. Well, no. Sometimes it takes a shock to get folks to think honestly about things they's always taken for granted, but just because they had an emotional reaction, that don't mean that the problems they found with Christianity ain't real problems. And rejecting their testimony on the grounds that they's just quote-unquote being emotional is an ad hominem fallacy. If you want to see genuine examples of folks being blinded by emotions, just look at how right-wing media talks about trans folks and gay folks and immigrants. Fear, 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 hate, hate, hate. Try and point out to somebody in a MAGA hat that harmless differences is harmless and prepare for an emotional outburst. Logic, reason, and evidence don't got nothing to do with it. It's all emotion. Well, back to Greg. Quote, second, some balk because of prejudice. Their minds are already made up. They have prejudged your view before ever really listening to your reason. They are interested only in defending their entrenched position, not in considering other options. End quote. And this is true, and a good example of this is when apologists quotes Romans 1:19 and 20 to say that atheists know that God is real and they're just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. That is a perfect example of prejudging someone's views before or instead of listening to their reasons. Quote, finally, some people are just plain pig-headed. Their reason for resistance is no more elegant or sophisticated than simple rebellion. End quote. And this one's also true. But there's one more reason, which Greg don't mention, and I think you'll see why as soon as I tell you what it is. The last reason why folks don't always listen to valid arguments and evidence is because of indoctrination. Folks who's been trained since early childhood to assume things as the foundation of their cultural identity is going to have a strong resistance to challenging those assumptions later on, especially when folks like preachers and apologists makes a full-time career out of reinforcing those assumptions. Indoctrination teaches believers to respond with pre-programmed scripts whenever confronted with common criticisms of their theology instead of engaging thoughtfully with the content of the objection. When Greg teaches believers how to dismiss the arguments of ex-Christians by saying they's just being emotional, that's indoctrination. When pastors preach that Romans 1 proves that atheists is lying when they says they don't believe in God, that's indoctrination. And when a believer starts to deconstruct their faith and finds themselves under serious peer pressure to stop, that's indoctrination too. So indoctrination may be the most powerful reason of all for why folks won't listen to sound logic and verifiable evidence. But Greg don't want to mention that because his whole career is dedicated to indoctrinating folks. Now, Greg promised that he would teach us all how to deal with what he calls the steamrollers, but it's all pretty much common sense, so I'll spare you all his smarmy, condescending examples and just give you the gist of it. If someone interrupts you with new questions while you're still answering the old one, politely ask them to wait till you've finished answering the first one. If they persist in interrupting you, point out that it's impolite to interrupt and that you, hopefully, have been extending to them the courtesy of listening. And finally, if they still being abusive, just end the conversation. Now, Greg uses the phrase, shake off the dust of your feet, which is a reference to the promise Jesus made to his disciples that he would inflict horrific pain and suffering on those who did not listen. So there's that. Good old-fashioned Christian love again. And that's pretty much it for Chapter 14, so let's move on to the next one, which Greg entitles Rhodes Scholar. He's talking specifically about science and what scientists says about the universe, and he says this, quote, "A tactic I call Rhodes Scholar is invaluable. It provides a way of assessing whether or not an appeal to authority is legitimate or not," end quote. And as Greg explains, the way he makes that assessment is by distinguishing between what a scientist says and why they says it. And when he says we should look at why, he means we need to look at the evidence supporting the scientific conclusions, right?
Oh. That's just what they'll be expecting us to do.
More on that later, but first, credit where credit is due. Greg does point out a reasonable caveat when it comes to scientific expertise. Quote, "Sometimes authorities give opinions that are outside of their area of expertise," end quote. And this is true, and it's something to watch out for. You see this sort of thing a lot in creationist literature where they will quote, "Dr. So-and-so was saying that evolution is complete unscientific hogwash," without mentioning the fact that his doctorate is in dental surgery. For example, in 2019, a creationist think tank called the Discovery Institute published a list of hundreds of PhD scientists who have signed a statement saying, quote, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged," end quote. That's fine and all, except they titled their statement, quote, "A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism," end quote. And that's doubly misleading. First of all, skepticism ain't dissent. Skepticism just means your confidence in your conclusions should be proportional to the evidence that supports them. That's why I'm both skeptical about evolution and confident that evolution is real. It fits the facts better than any of the alternatives. Secondly, Darwinism ain't the modern theory of evolution, nor is evolution limited to just mutation and natural selection. So again, I could sign this statement myself because I know that some of the variation in modern species is due to things like genetic drift and gene flow, above and beyond what mutation and natural selection produce on their own. So what the Discovery Institute has really done is to produce a lukewarm statement that don't really challenge modern evolutionary theory at all, but they've phrased it in a way that sounds like they's dissenting from it. And then they got a list of PhDs to cite it. But when you look at the list, you find a few PhDs in relevant fields, but you also find a lot of folks with degrees in things like inorganic chemistry, mathematics, radiology, structural engineering, stuff like that. So Greg's caveat is a good one. Whenever you hear a statement from a scientific authority, always check whether or not their statement falls within their proper area of expertise. Otherwise, it's just a personal opinion. Anyways, back to Greg. So far, he's been pretty fair, pointing out that we need to respect scientific research and we need to bear in mind whether or not a particular scientist might be speaking outside of their own particular area of expertise. So far, so good, but that's about to change. Quote, "Sometimes one's destination is predetermined by where one starts. If a scholar begins an investigation convinced that miracles cannot happen, it will be difficult for him to conclude that something supernatural has taken place, even when there is overwhelming evidence in favor of it." End quote. Greg calls this tactic the Rhodes Scholar tactic, but in fact it has a much older and more common name, the ad hominem fallacy. If a scientist finds answers that don't support your religious dogmas, just accuse the scientists of having an anti-supernatural bias and then proceed to ignore both their findings and the evidence supporting it on the basis of that accusation. And this particular ad hominem fallacy is one that's pretty popular among creationists as a way to distract attention from the evidence and deflect the conversation onto an argument over the moral integrity of scientists. But, as a matter of fact, not only is this a logical fallacy, it's based on an accusation that can't possibly be true. See, the thing is that in order for scientists to be biased against the supernatural, they has to be able to identify the supernatural when they see it so's they knows what to reject. And they can't do that because they ain't no objective, testable, verifiable standard for distinguishing between what's genuinely supernatural and what's just natural things that we don't understand yet. And without a meaningful standard for telling what's supernatural and what's just poorly understood, scientists can't reject the supernatural without rejecting everything that they don't understand. And if you knows anything at all about scientists, you know that's the exact opposite of how scientists react to things they don't understand. You look at creationists, and sure, as soon as they hit something they don't understand, they call a halt to all further investigation and just say God did it. But when scientists hit something they don't understand, they don't shut down, they get excited. They love the unknown because that means there's more to be discovered. And they love discovering stuff. And thing is, as they investigate and explore and make hypotheses and test them, they find answers that's consistent with observable, objective reality because that's how science works. It tests its hypotheses against the standard of objective reality and finds the answers that's most consistent with that reality. Now, when you find answers that's consistent with observable, objective reality, them answers is going to be non-supernatural by definition, because supernatural means it ain't consistent with verifiable reality. But that ain't evidence of some kind of anti-supernatural bias on the part of scientists. That's just an artifact of how we define what we mean by supernatural. So even though the ad hominem fallacy sounds superficially plausible to folks that don't dig too far into it, it's simply a baseless accusation that couldn't possibly be true. Greg's so-called Rhodes Scholar tactic is just an exercise in self-deception and deliberate ignorance of the facts. Greg builds on this deception by proposing two definitions of science. The first is the ordinary definition of science, that is, the discovery of new information about the world around us through the application of the scientific method. The second, however, is more of the same classic creationist ad hominem. Quote, the second definition of science involves a philosophy, specifically the philosophy of naturalistic materialism. All phenomena must be explained in terms of matter and energy governed by natural law. Any view that does not conform to this second definition is also not science. And this is false because science does not have an omniscient knowledge of everything that's part of natural law. One of the main things that science does is to discover new natural laws, or new ramifications of the natural laws we already know. And it does that by making repeatable, verifiable observations of objective reality. And this has major implications for any so-called supernatural phenomena. Once again, science has no way to know a priori whether some new phenomenon is supernatural or is just some previously unknown natural law. All science knows is whether or not something can be reliably and verifiably observed in objective reality. If it can be reliably and verifiably observed, then it becomes part of science's understanding of natural law. And if it can't, then science has no reason to accept it as being valid science, because it ain't. In a sense, this rules out the supernatural, but only because once something is scientifically verified to be part of objective reality, it ceases to count as supernatural. This ain't anti-supernatural bias, it's just basing your conclusions on verifiable reality. Now, to be fair to creationists, there's some skeptical scientists who miss this point and who proudly proclaim that they reject the supernatural on philosophical grounds and base their entire worldview on materialistic naturalism. And of course, such statements is a rich source of quote mines for creationists. And I can understand why scientists might feel motivated to express their views in those terms, but I think it's counterproductive. It's much better to point out that the practical work of science is built on verifiable observations, not on philosophical presuppositions. And that's the beauty of the scientific method. If the supernatural was real, science would find it, despite any philosophical biases that any individual scientist might happen to have. All it takes is for the supernatural to be verifiably and repeatably observable in objective reality. And if the supernatural can't do that, that ain't science's fault. Meanwhile, Greg wants to argue that scientists is ignoring genuine empirical evidence. Quote, "The origin of life, for example, and the incredible biological diversity of the living world consistently defy any naturalistic explanation. Instead, powerful and persuasive empirical evidence points to design." End quote. And once again, we see that Greg's so-called intelligent designer is an imaginary character who's limited to doing only what Greg is willing and able to imagine him doing. Greg is either unwilling or unable to imagine him designing something as powerful and flexible and innovative as evolution, so Greg knows beyond all possible doubt that he didn't do it. And that's why he takes evidence of evolution as being evidence of some kind of less capable design. Greg is wrong, of course, about biological diversity and the origin of life defying naturalistic explanations. These is both fields of ongoing research, and we ain't hit any dead ends yet. The fact that we ain't there yet don't prove that we's on the wrong road, much as Greg would like it to be otherwise. And as for design, well, to prove design, you have to show two things. First, you have to show specific function, and that part's easy since evolution selects for functional properties. But function alone ain't enough to demonstrate design. You also got to show that there was prior intent to produce that specific function. And that part's going to be harder. See, lots of things can have functions that they was never intended to have. If a tree falls across a small creek, it can function as a bridge for squirrels and such without anybody ever intending to build a bridge. If a landslide happens to bring down enough dirt and rubble to fill a river valley, it can function, at least temporarily, as a dam without any design. A penknife can be used as a screwdriver even though it weren't designed for it. Probably won't do the knife much good, but you can still use it for purposes it weren't intended for. And that means that even if you find genuine function, you have not demonstrated actual design because actual design requires prior intent. And Greg, of course, has no way to demonstrate that. He assumes there was prior intent, but he can't demonstrate it scientifically. And without prior intent, all we've got is a universe that's consistent with itself and its own natural laws. And scientists can study and observe how the materials and processes of nature work to produce the world we have today. So there ain't any scientific reason to go looking for any supernatural intelligent designer. The universe already makes perfect sense without one. And Greg rants and raves for a page or so about how scientists is all censoring the so-called intelligent design researchers and how the ID guys is using the same methods as real scientists and just reaching different conclusions. And of course, that's all just hand-waving. Until you demonstrate scientifically that there was prior intent to produce the specific functions we see in the world around us, the intelligent design community ain't got a leg to stand on scientifically. They can fool folks who ain't scientists, but it's all just a big old grift. Greg goes on to apply this same logical fallacy to the academic study of the historical Jesus. Quote, "Magazine stories about Easter are quick to point out that most scholars reject the resurrection. But why do they reject it? A closer examination reveals their starting point. In a materialistic view of the universe, resurrections do not happen. Therefore, any report of a corpse walking out of a tomb after 3 days must be a myth added to the records years later, regardless of any evidence to the contrary." End quote. And before we get to my main point here, let's just take a minute to notice how Greg himself is embellishing the story of the resurrection. Not one of the Gospels ever report that anybody ever saw Jesus' body get up and walk out of the tomb. That's a detail that's being added by Greg's imagination in order to reinforce his belief in a bodily resurrection. Even without intending to deceive anybody, Greg is automatically and irresistibly adding embellishments to the original story. And it's fair for us to suppose that he ain't the first to do so. But back to his objection. A better way to state the materialistic view would be to say that mythical accounts of resurrections is far, far more common in ancient literature than actual corpses coming back from the dead after 3 days. This very strongly suggests that we should consider whether the gospel accounts fit the same pattern or whether there's any additional evidence that would lead to a different conclusion. Now, Greg wants us to think that historians simply ignore the additional evidence, but that's once again the opposite of the truth. Historians love to uncover ancient evidence relative to historical questions. The problem ain't that historians is biased against the gospel stories, it's that they ain't sufficiently biased in favor of the gospel to suit Greg. He's using his Rhodes Scholar tactic to insinuate that historians is letting personal bias interfere with their academic study, but that's just another ad hominem fallacy that he uses to change the subject away from any discussion of the actual evidence. Ironically, Greg himself exposes the weakness of his own tactic. Quote, "It is not fair to assume someone has distorted the facts simply because he has a stake in the matter. People who are not neutral can still be fair and impartial. If you think there has been distort and bias, you have to demonstrate it by looking carefully at the evidence itself." End quote. This observation blows his Rhodes Scholar tactic completely away, but he only mentions it in a section on whether it's okay to question the bias of Christian apologists. It's a double standard, because when Greg uses his Rhodes Scholar tactic on historians, his whole focus is on questioning their motives in bad faith without really debating the evidence. If he was really interested in debating the evidence, he'd be addressing the evidence, not raising baseless accusations against historians. And that's it for Chapter 15. A whole chapter devoted to paying lip service to scholarship while using an ad hominem fallacy to try and discredit the scholars, which is just the sort of material we'd expect apologists to be stuck with in the absence of any genuinely real God. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we'll open up Chapter 16, which is entitled Just the Facts, Ma'am. Supposedly he's going to debunk some of what he calls popular myths about Christianity. And I guarantee we're going to have some fun with that. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.